আপন বুকের পাঁজর চালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলো রে, যদি তোর ডানাতে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে। একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো, একলা চলো রে।
Hi guys, thank you for checking out this video. I have spent the better part of today reading the West Bengal budget speech delivered by Finance Minister Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. And after going through it carefully, I think most people are going to come away with the wrong impression. The BJP supporters will celebrate it as a revolutionary document. The opposition will dismiss it as propaganda. I don't think any of those reactions captures what is actually interesting about this budget. Because my problem with this budget is not that it is bad. In fact, there is a lot in it that I genuinely like. My problem is that it feels strangely cautious. It feels like the budget of a government with 150 seats, not 208. And that distinction matters because Bengal did not give this government a cautious mandate. Bengal gave it one of the largest mandates in the state's political history. The voters did not ask for hesitation. They asked for change. And nowhere is that contradiction more visible than in the section dealing with land reforms. The government openly acknowledges that the urban land ceiling framework has become an obstacle to investment. It recognizes the problem. It understands the economic cost. It practically admits that this belongs to a different era. And then it says it will be re-examined. Re-examined. That one word kept jumping out at me throughout the speech. Because the budget repeatedly identifies the right problems but often stops one step short of the obvious solution. That is why I would describe this as a good budget with a confidence problem. Now, before I get to my criticisms, let me acknowledge the positives. For the first time in a very long time, a Bengal budget is speaking the language of growth and productivity, rather than mere redistribution. There is a serious infrastructure push, the new town elevated corridor, the Dankuni-Mogra corridor, investments in river transport, the Murigonga bridge, the improved connectivity proposals in North Bengal. These are exactly the kinds of investments a state should be making if it wants to become economically competitive. A productive economy is built on infrastructure. Businesses don't invest because ministers give speeches. They invest because goods can move efficiently and markets can be reached predictably. Now let me come to the announcement that genuinely excited me, the deep sea port. I don't think enough people appreciate how important this could be. Ports are not glamorous. Nobody gets emotional about port infrastructure. But ports change history. Singapore understood this. Dubai understood this. Shenzhen understood this. Rotterdam understood this. Historically, Bengal became prosperous because it sat at the center of maritime commerce. Trade built this region. For decades, we have spoken about industrial revival while neglecting one of the most important pieces of economic infrastructure imaginable. If executed properly, a deep-sea port could end up being more consequential than many of the welfare schemes that dominate political headlines. This was one of the few moments in the speech where I found myself thinking not about the next election but about the next generation. And I hope this project receives the urgency it deserves. And the optimism does not end there. In the post-budget press conference, Chief Minister Suvendu Adhikari went a step further and announced a 5,000 crore rupees investment incentive package aimed at attracting private capital into the state. He actually mentioned this. The finance minister himself mentioned this during the speech as well. I just missed it. I just got it when Suvendu mentioned it in the press conference. Now, this is precisely the kind of thinking I want to see more of. For decades, Bengal politics assumed that investors owed the state something. Successful economies understand the opposite. The state must compete for investment. Capital has choices, factories have choices, entrepreneurs have choices. If Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Telangana and Karnataka are competing aggressively for investment, Bengal cannot simply assume investors will arrive because we have a glorious history and excellent literature. A 5,000 crore rupees incentive package signals that the government understands that attracting investment is not a passive exercise. It requires deliberate effort. I would still prefer structural reforms over subsidies and incentives, but if the choice is between actively competing for investment and continuing the old culture of bureaucratic indifference, I will take active competition every time. The technology section is also encouraging. There is an AI mission, there is a startup policy on the horizon, there are incubation funds and venture capital allocations, there is even a science talent attraction fund. For decades, Bengal's greatest export has been its own human capital. Our brightest students, scientists, entrepreneurs and professionals leave for Bengaluru, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Delhi, Singapore, London or America. Any government serious about Bengal's future has to think about reversing that trend. At least this budget recognizes that challenge. Another announcement that deserves more attention is the proposal for a major IT park in North Bengal, along with plans to develop a semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem in the region. I think this is strategically important. For too long, discussions about economic development in West Bengal have been excessively Kolkata centric. North Bengal cannot merely be treated as a tourist destination or a transit corridor. It must become a center of wealth creation in its own right. If even a fraction of these technology investments materialize, it could fundamentally alter the economic geography of the state. For decades, ambitious young people from Siliguri, Jalpaiguri, Kuch Bihar, and Alipurduar have had to migrate elsewhere for high value employment. The idea that North Bengal could emerge as a technology and manufacturing hub is exactly the kind of long term thinking that Bengal desperately needs. This was another section of the speech where I felt the government was moving in the right direction. One part of the speech that I found interesting was the emphasis on promoting Durga Puja as a major global cultural and tourism brand. And to be clear, I completely support that objective. Durga Puja is one of Bengal's greatest cultural exports. It deserves international promotion. But I would go one step further. If the objective is to build a cultural tourism economy in Bengal, then why stop at Durga Puja? Why not create an integrated Bengal heritage circuit? And I think the government is kind of on the way to doing pretty much that as well. Think about what Bengal already possesses. Kalighat, Dakshineshwar, Tarapit, Belur Math, Mayapur, Jagannath Temple at Jagannath Cultural Center at Digha, Gangashagar, Bishnupur. These are not merely religious sites, they are economic assets. Pilgrimage tourism creates hotels, restaurants, transport services, guides, handicrafts, and employment. Durga Puja should be the flagship, but it should not be the entire fleet. The implementation of Ayushman Bharat is another welcome step. For years, healthcare became trapped inside a political turf war between the state and the center. Citizens paid the price for that confrontation. If that chapter is finally ending, then good. It should have ended years ago. The recruitment reforms are also significant. After everything Bengal has witnessed regarding recruitment controversies and examination scandals, rebuilding trust in public institutions matters enormously. Now, let me come to where I disagree with the budget. The first issue is ideological. This budget is not socialist, but it is certainly Keynesian. The central assumption running through the speech is that growth will come primarily through government spending, infrastructure spending, welfare spending, recruitment spending, state-backed investment, cash transfer programs, government-led stimulus. Now, there is nothing inherently irrational about Keynesian economics, although you could very well argue there is. Every modern government uses some Keynesian tools, but from a libertarian perspective, that the question is different. Growth does not happen merely because governments spend money. Growth happens when entrepreneurs are free to create wealth. Growth happens when capital faces fewer barriers. Growth happens when regulations stop suffocating initiative. And that is where I think the budget reveals its biggest weakness. The government seems much more comfortable spending money than dismantling obstacles. Whenever the budget has to choose between creating a new scheme and removing an old barrier, it usually appears more enthusiastic about the scheme. That is not a socialist instinct, but it is certainly not a deeply free market instinct either. And that brings me back to the land ceiling issue. The government knows what the problem is. The question is whether it is willing to act on that knowledge. The second issue concerns the repeated emphasis on 33% reservation for women across various sectors. The question is whether reservation is the correct mechanism for women's emancipation. My concern is not about women, it's about the principle. A society should focus on removing barriers to participation rather than predetermining outcomes. If Bengal becomes safer, more prosperous, and more meritocratic, women will succeed in greater numbers without requiring the state to decide in advance what proportion of positions must be occupied by whom. A government that believes in merit should be focusing on expanding opportunity rather than engineering outcomes. Another proposal that will generate discussion is the pension and support mechanism for individuals who suffered politically motivated false cases. I suspect many viewers expect me to criticize this. I actually don't, at least not the principle behind it. If an individual genuinely lost years of his life, his livelihood, his savings, or his reputation because state institutions were weaponized for political purposes, then acknowledging that injustice is entirely legitimate. A government that talks about rule of law cannot simply ignore such people. My concern is procedural. The credibility of this program will depend entirely on how claims are verified. The government must establish standards that are transparent, rigorous, and politically neutral. Otherwise, a scheme intended to correct political victimization could itself become another instrument of political favoritism. The real test is not whether victims are compromised or compensated. The real test is whether even the government's critics would trust the process. Now, let me briefly address some of the criticisms raised by the opposition led by Ritubrata Banerjee. One criticism was that the budget does not provide sufficient specificity regarding where various infrastructure projects will ultimately be located. I understand the concern, but frankly, I do not find it particularly persuasive. This is not a full 5-year budget, this is effectively an 8-month budget presented immediately after a change in government. The detailed project level allocations, implementations, schedules, and location specific plans will naturally emerge in subsequent policy documents and in the next full budget cycle. Expecting every major infrastructure project to arrive with complete geographical specificity at this stage strikes me as unrealistic. The more familiar criticism from the left was directed at the government's emphasis on privatization, disinvestment, and creating a business-friendly environment. The argument, as always, is that profit maximization should not become the guiding principle of economic policy. I have never found this argument convincing. Profit is not the enemy of prosperity. Profit is evidence that value has been created for somebody voluntarily. When businesses compete for customers, profit becomes a signal that resources are being used productively. The real question is not whether profit exists. The real question is whether profits are earned through competition or through political leverage or through political privilege. A state that treats profit itself as suspicious eventually discovers that investment is suspicious of the state as well. And Bengal has already spent enough decades learning that lesson. And that brings me to the broader issue. This budget contains intelligence, competence, it contains several genuinely promising ideas. What I do not see enough of is confidence. A government with 208 seats should not sound uncertain about reform. It should not sound hesitant about removing obstacles to growth. It should not be speaking the language of re-examination when it already knows what is broken. Bengal's tragedy over the last 50 years has never been a shortage of diagnosis. Every government knew what the problems were. The question was whether it possessed the courage to challenge the interests that benefited from those problems. This budget shows a government that understands many of Bengal's economic challenges. I am still waiting to see whether it is willing to pursue the solutions with the same confidence that Bengal's voters showed when they handed it power. That is why I come away from this budget with mixed feelings. I see more economic intelligence in this document than in many Bengal budgets of the last 3 decades. I see a genuine desire to attract investment. I see an understanding that infrastructure matters. I see recognition that technology, logistics, and manufacturing must drive the next phase of growth. I even see occasional flashes of genuine reformist instinct. What I do not see yet is the confidence that should accompany a 208-seat mandate. The government often sounds like it is negotiating with Bengal's past rather than replacing it. And that is ultimately my criticism. Not that the destination is wrong, the destination is largely correct. The question is whether this government possesses the courage to reach it at the speed Bengal now requires. Because Bengal did not elect a government to re-examine the future. It elected a government to rebuild it. Thank you for watching.
আপন বুকের পাঁজর চালিয়ে নিয়ে একলা চলরে যদি তোর ডানাতে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো